I was originally hired because the cemetery had a period of time where they experienced some people sneaking in to perform rituals. I was 21 years old, doing this as a side job, with nothing to protect myself. I was given a barcode scanner and was told to drive through the entire cemetery every hour or so to patrol, and to scan each of the pre-posted barcodes to prove I was actually doing it. Now, this cemetery was massive, pretty much broken into 3 parts: the newer part, the historic part, and the famous part where celebrities are buried. I did this routine once and never did it again, going so far as to break the barcode scanner so I didn't have to do it. While I was driving, it was pitch black. Coming around a long curved road, my headlights picked up what I could have sworn were a pair of legs walking across the path, but only up to the knees. Shoes, pants, knees, then absolutely nothing. I stopped in the road and just watched this pair of legs cross 10 feet in front of me. I put the car in reverse, did what felt like the longest K-turn of my life, and noped it straight back to the parking lot. Normally my then girlfriend, now my wife, would drop by the cemetery around 8 p.m. and bring me dinner, since I couldn't really leave. I never told her about my weird experiences because I didn't want to freak her out. As I'm walking her back to her car to leave, I see her reach back and touch her ponytail, then look around with a look on her face. I ask her what's wrong, and she says, "Nothing. I must have got my ponytail caught in a tree branch. I felt something." So I pointed out to her that the closest tree was 20 feet away, and that's impossible. Then she gets really pale and says it felt like someone ran their hand through her hair, front to back, and then pulled on the ponytail. We were both pretty freaked out, and she left. She never came and brought me dinner again. I worked the 4 to 12 in the morning shift. The cemetery generally closed at 6, so around 5:30, I would lock the main gate, then would start driving through the cemetery to notify any visitors that we'd be closing soon. So one day, I'm in the middle of my final drive-through and see an old lady slowly walking the sidewalk alongside a mausoleum. The mausoleum was hundreds of feet long, about 20 feet tall, and had no breaks in it. It was one long stretch. The road ran directly alongside the sidewalk of the mausoleum, so I pull up behind the lady. To tell her we're closing, get out of my car, take my eyes off of her for a split second as I'm getting out of the car, and when I shut the door and look up, she's gone. Completely vanished. I didn't think anything paranormal at first. I just thought maybe I lost sight of her. But the sidewalk and road were completely empty. I ran all the way around to check the back of the mausoleum, but no one was there. Across from the mausoleum was a whole field of graves, and I eagle-eyed every row. Not a soul in sight. I finish up my roundup and sit in my car the rest of the night in a well-lit area. I saw a fully visible person, I know it. No tricks of light, no hallucination. Plain as day. I was chatting with an old man in the mausoleum one day, and he was rambling on about his wife and how her crypt looks so nice with the marble and such, and he had his hand resting on his niche next to hers. After we part ways, I looked at his spot, and it had a death date on it. We only sandblast death dates after they have been entombed. Creepy. The city wanted to develop on my family's cemetery about 100 years ago. My family agreed to sell them the land we had if the city would then also pay for a portion of the land next to it, on which my family could continue the business. When that happened, my family had to inform all the other families, with buried loved ones, that the remains of their dearly departed were going to be moved into new plots. Work began on that, and as bulldozers and other large shoveling equipment wasn't yet common, it all had to be done by hand. The ground was dug up, the caskets were retrieved and moved along with their headstones down to the new, freshly dug plots. Back then, caskets were generally made of wood with a decorative cloth laid over it. These wooden caskets more often than not weighed roughly equal to or less than the body they contained. In many cases, the weight of the body inside was discernible from the casket itself. Well, when they got to the final, northernmost third of the land that the city had bought, the caskets became lighter. The sounds of the corpses within slight sliding, a jerky step making a limb fall to one side, hitting the inside of the box, etc., began to become fewer and farther between. Eventually, with the last 20 or so caskets, they felt like there was nothing inside at all. With the permission of the families, the cemetery employees opened these caskets they thought were empty, and found just that to be the case. The insides of the caskets were bare, and looked as if there hadn't ever been anything inside them. I wasn't intentionally seeking out cemetery employment. It happened accidentally, but I quickly became smitten. It was pleasantly quiet, and I was also able to connect with people, such as those visiting late loved ones and participating in ceremonies, without becoming overwhelmed. However, there is a particular statue of a weeping angel in the cemetery that locals, and even out-of-state visitors, are wary of due to the alleged paranormal activity surrounding it at nightfall that is echoing cries, foggy apparitions, the angel herself moving. Because of this, the cemetery has become one of the top ghost hunting cemeteries, much to my dismay. I will admit, I sometimes feel sick near the statue and tend to only venture near the lot if daylight is out. But I work third shift now, so this is almost always unavoidable. I'm highly skeptical of the paranormal, so I write it off as paranoia from all the stories I've heard. But tending to anything near it is not among one of my favorite tasks to perform. I try to switch out with other groundskeepers, but no one wants to do it. I mean, I've seen one of my coworkers, who is a grown man in his 50s, intentionally hide from our superintendent to avoid it. Many of the men's stones from quite a few years back have the Freemason symbol, and almost all of those men's wives have an upside-down star on their stones. I haven't actually researched what it means, but it's interesting. We see little children on the outskirts of the cemetery by the tree line, always dressed in white, always cannot be seen clearly. They are usually in the trees a bit, or just look obscured from a distance. We never see one up close, but it has happened about 5 times since I've been there. We nickname them tree children. It was a quiet day, so I pulled my car around the back of the old chapel to take a nap. The chapel was surrounded by 12-foot-high hedges, so I figured it was a good spot to park for an hour and shut my eyes. I fall asleep and wake up to see my car completely surrounded by decomposing people. So real, so vivid, so much detail. They were all pressed up against the glass and windshield. They had on the outfits they were buried in suits, dresses, but all dirty and in different stages of decomposition. No one spoke, no one moved. They all just stared like I was some zoo exhibit. Then I woke up. I had been asleep, and it was a dream. The thing is, it felt so real. I have never had a dream so real, so vivid before or after. I took it as a message. I called my boss and quit as soon as I left at 4. The cremation chamber naturally has an exhaust. I was sleeping one night when my wife shook me awake. I got up and went to the window and saw that from the exhaust, there was thick smoke pluming out, as if someone was being cremated. Seeing as we're the ones who operate the crematorium, and neither of us were there, this absolutely should not have been happening. I had my wife call the police while I went over to check on things. A fire of over 1,000 degrees was likely burning inside. One way or another, it had to be turned off as quickly as possible, or at the very least controlled. All the lights were off, and the doors were locked, as they were every night. I went inside, and the inside of the retort was bright with flames, but there was nothing inside it. We meticulously cleaned the cremation chamber after each use, and while the flames alone would likely produce some kind of smoke, the smoke that we saw coming from the exhaust was the kind of thick, gray and black smoke that could only be produced by something actually physically burning. I shut it off and went around to check the windows and postern doors, which were all intact and locked. There is a ladder that leads to a ceiling exit, but that too was locked from the inside. The police showed up and took a report, but there was really nothing to be done. It was attributed to someone having left the retort on before leaving, even though my wife and I both knew the other hadn't done that. That's one that I'll forever ponder. One afternoon, my coworker and I were walking the paved roads in there with a trash bag, looking for litter. We came upon a particular area of the cemetery that has a lot of mausoleums and took the next lane around a corner that goes along the side of one mausoleum. As we rounded it, there was an older gentleman, maybe in his late 60s, early 70s, standing with his back against the side of the mausoleum, just looking at a plot of graves nearby. Two things were kind of weird about him. He was dressed a bit odd. His clothes were a little out of date. Corduroy jacket in 80-degree weather and one of those newsboy type caps, long pants, button-up shirt. But when you think about it, a lot of elderly people kind of dress in out-of-date clothing anyway, so I shrugged that off. The second thing, he had a coffee mug he was drinking out of. Not a thermos or a styrofoam cup with a lid, an actual ceramic coffee mug that he was sipping out of right in the middle of the cemetery. We waved to each other and kept walking. We were only a few feet away when the other girl said, "That was a little weird," and we both looked over our shoulders back at him, but he was gone. We stopped and kind of took a few steps back to see if he'd walked around the mausoleum or something, but we couldn't see him anymore. A couple days later, we both showed up for work and found one of the regular workers to let him know we were there. We talked to him for a few minutes, and I brought up seeing the old man by the mausoleum in the east section. The groundskeeper smiled and asked, "Did he have a coffee mug?" We said, "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, that's our ghost. He's not really there." We pressed for more explanation, and he said he's always seen in that spot, looking at a family plot, and always has a coffee mug. He said there is a grave for the wife, 2 daughters, and the husband. The husband's grave says that he passed in the early 70s, and the wife and 2 daughters' graves say they passed a couple of decades before, and the 3 of them have the exact same date their lives ended. They think he was the dad, and that he maybe used to visit his wife and daughter's graves a lot. He told us people only see him for a few seconds, then he's gone. I've had a number of odd experiences with our crematorium. One such instance was in 2012, following a service for a very large man. I got the cremation chamber preheated while my wife set up a movie to watch while the man was cremated. I used the elevating platform and then slid him in, closing the door to the retort afterwards, and went to sit down. About 5 minutes after I'd shut the door to the retort, we heard a thump. Neither of us paid it much mind, but a few moments later there was another, and then another. I stood up, worried that the man may have had a pacemaker still inside him, however unlikely, as he had had his organs removed. The thumping and thudding got more hurried. We looked through the front window of the retort and couldn't believe what we were seeing. The man inside was flailing about. Both of his arms and legs were bouncing around like he was in extreme pain. Now, it isn't odd to see parts move while someone is being cremated as the limbs are broken down. They will often contract as muscles and tendons snap. But this was most decidedly not that. The man's fingers were balled up in fists and were banging against the windows, and his legs seemed to be kicking downward, as if to get out. The man's mouth opened and first groans began emanating from within, then screams. There was no way, absolutely no way whatsoever, that he could still have been alive. But for about 20 seconds after we'd gone up to the retort, The man inside the cremation chamber screamed and flailed his arms and legs about. My family has owned a cemetery for nearly 5 generations, and I've been working there since I was 12. The house that my family built on the property is about 30 yards back from the main office. One night when they were kids, my grandpa and uncle were up late. My uncle happened to look out their window and swore to my grandpa that he'd seen someone walk behind one of the trees. The lamppost illuminated the very first handful of plots and headstones on the other side of the road, but at that point, they were undisturbed. My grandpa and uncle stood at their window for a little while, with my grandpa ultimately teasing my uncle for being scared. However, when they woke up the next morning, the police were there. In the hours between when they looked out the window and saw the burial plots undisturbed, about 4 in the morning and the time they noticed the commotion, about 7 in the morning, 7 of the plots had been dug up. The headstones were stacked very deliberately, like a house of cards, and behind them the caskets were atop one another, the first one laying flat, the next one straight up, then flat, straight up, with a final one flat. With basic casket dimensions taken into account, that's nearly 30 feet high. I'm sure you can imagine, even with machinery in the present day, that would take at least a little bit of time to accomplish. But nope, back in the 1950s, this was somehow done in a span of less than 180 minutes, with no one that lived in the house able to hear it going on. Dave is the oldest of the workers and has been here forever. I ask him, "Hey Dave, have you ever experienced anything creepy here?" Dave replies, "Back in the 80s, I began working here with old Frank. One afternoon, we had a funeral for a child whose last name was kinda odd and sticks with you, Eagleton. We lowered the casket without a hitch. His family was gone. It was just about 8 of us. We started lowering the vault cover that his family bought, and my rope surprisingly snapped. My side came crashing down and took out the bottom right of the casket. I looked down there, and there the kid was. All I saw was his leg. Black pants, creamy white shoes. I had to go sit down after that while they fixed the cover. I was sitting literally 5 feet from the guys on a bench when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I looked over, and it was a young man. He had a watering can and was in an all-blue suit. I figured he was going to water flowers at another grave or something. He calmly chuckles. "You're definitely not the first person to do that. Don't worry about it. We all end up buried." I laughed with him and watched him walk over to another grave under a maple tree and started watering the flowers at the stone. I walked over to check on the guys and, just making sure because I do believe in ghosts, ask, "Hey Frank, is that guy actually there?" Frank responds, "That's not funny, of course he's there." I laugh, but the next time we look over, he's gone. I've never seen old Frank so startled in his life. He tells me, "That grave is a single and hasn't been dug yet. There's not supposed to be a tombstone." Old Frank pulls me to the side and tells me to keep it between us. I walk around 10 paces to the gravesite, and my jaw drops. There's not a thing there. No tombstone, no nothing. A few years go by, and Dave passes away. His burial was in an older section that rarely has burials anymore. We were lowering him, and an innocent part-time kid couldn't bear the weight of the vault cover and dropped it. We finished it, and I walked down to talk to the kid, telling him not to worry. It happens to everyone. I brought a pail of water to fill up next to the bench so I can water the sad, lonely flower pot someone brought for Dave. I put my hand on the kid's shoulder and joked while filling it up. I started walking up the hill, and I noticed a grave with a name I couldn't forget, Eagleton. I had tunnel vision right to Dave's grave and up to the maple tree it was under. I'm in shock, and I look all over my body while I'm wearing a navy blue suit. I immediately ran to the records cabinet to check to see when this gravesite was bought by Dave. I went through pages and pages of years of binders filled with the records of purchases and who's where. Dave and his family never purchased the grave. No one has ever purchased that grave. My mom and stepdad were the caretakers of a small cemetery for about 10 years. All of us kids, 6 of us between the two of them, helped out at one point or another. One summer, I was helping my mom with mowing and upkeep. It was a super hot summer, so we would try to go and get the mowing done early before the heat became too unbearable. Well, we had trouble getting the truck going one day, so we ended up starting a little later than usual and were unable to finish up everything that day. My mom had an appointment the next morning, and the day after that it was supposed to rain. So I told her I would go up early the next morning and finish up the trimming with the weed eater. So, it's about 7 o'clock in the morning, and I am listening to music with my headphones and going around the headstones. Everything was going well until I got to the oldest section of the cemetery. That part was on a small slope of a hill. When I finished up the last headstone, I turned off my equipment and started back up the hill. I glanced up in time to see a little girl in a pretty red dress. She was running and disappeared behind a large headstone. I figured her parents were visiting another grave, and the little girl ran off to entertain herself. It was around 9 o'clock in the morning at this point. I got to the top of the hill, and there was no car or people around. The cemetery wasn't really close to any houses, and the girl was too nicely dressed to have walked out there. I looked around and shouted for her to come out. I was able to see the headstone she ran behind. I would have seen her if she ran out again. I couldn't find her anywhere. I called my mom and told her what was going on. I asked if I should call the police to tell them about this little girl. She looked to be about 3 or 4 years old, so she certainly shouldn't be by herself. My mom asked me if she was wearing a red dress. I said yes, why? She proceeds to nonchalantly tell me that it was just the ghost girl. Now, everyone who knows me knows that I am terrified of ghosts. I asked why she didn't tell me there was a ghost in the cemetery. She said she needed my help and was afraid I wouldn't go if I thought it was haunted. Now, granted, I probably would have been more leery of the place, but knowing no one else could help her, I would have still helped her that summer. But I would have made sure I wasn't there by myself. I still go there sometimes, as I have relatives buried there, but I am always with someone. Fortunately, I never saw any other ghosts, and I have never seen the little ghost girl ever again. When I was in college, I worked part-time at a Jewish cemetery in reception office management. The cemetery was closed from Friday afternoon through Saturday evening for Sabbath. We sometimes stayed a bit later in the office on Friday afternoons to get bills out or checks processed. We heard a loud commotion by the cemetery entrance, which was locked, and only staff could get in and out. The office manager went to see what was going on and made me come with her. We went down to the gate to find an older woman, probably around 70, dressed to the nines, begging us to let her in. She kept saying she needed to get back. This was in the suburbs of New Jersey, so you needed a car to get around, but we didn't see a car or anything. She was just there in this beautiful dress. We couldn't open the gate without the cemetery manager, so we went to go get him. We brought him back to the gate, and no one was there. We looked at video footage of the entrance, and you could see us, the office manager and me, talking, but there was no one on the other side of the gate. The cemetery manager thought we were trying to trick him. I swear to this day, we saw a woman in a fancy dress outside that gate. There were multiple cameras, and not a single one picked up anyone on the other side of the gate, and you could see the whole gate. All you could see was us. I don't know if it was a ghost or what. The office manager and I decided not to tell anyone else, but we would mention it to each other every once in a while. I was a tombstone caretaker for a cemetery in rural Georgia. It was a summer job for a 16-year-old. Nothing crazy, just cleaning off the grime of the elements on tombstones. Now to just set the scene, the cemetery included one building that housed bathrooms for the 5 staff members of this cemetery. It was a small, simple mausoleum, and then other than that, flat earth with tombstones everywhere. The only surroundings were dense forests. That being said, due to the eerie surroundings, I was always a bit paranoid. Plus, I watch a lot of scary movies. So one night, I was doing my rounds, and I had to go into the small mausoleum. It had some of the richer families in the areas entombed within. I had to go in and make sure all was neat and clean. Standards had to be upheld for these uppity folks. I approached, and right off the bat, something was off. The air was pretty darn cold, even though this was during the summer in Georgia. There was also a light coming from the mausoleum. As I approached, I heard voices. Was it laughter? Laughter from a child, maybe a little girl, or maybe some younger kids had sneaked in. I haven't seen anyone enter or leave the cemetery, and the laughter sounded young. As I got closer, the voices and laughter died, like almost instantly. I paused. The light I also noticed had gone out. I called a lone security officer that does a few rounds on the lot, because I'm not gonna go in alone. We'll call him Officer Friendly. When Officer Friendly arrives, we both go inside. We see one of the doors to the entombed remains of a young girl open. Nothing seemed to be disturbed within, but it was still somehow open. A doll lay on the stone beneath it. Officer Friendly and I did a small sweep, which didn't take long. We closed the door to the girl's entombment, and after we get about 30 feet from the mausoleum, voices and laughter again. I jump, and Officer Friendly nervously asks me, "You hear it too?" We look back, and boom, lights flicker again, laughter continues. We don't go back and just book it. I found out the next morning that the door was open again, and this time the doll was on the other side of the mausoleum from where we found it the night before. I resigned the next day. If you enjoyed these stories and want to hear more unnerving tales, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any upcoming stories. Share this video with your friends and comment below. Which of these stories gave you the creeps? Thank you for listening and for your continued support on the channel. It is deeply appreciated.